Apple to Pearl.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us today. We're delighted to have David Shoemaker with us. He's a software engineer for Apple Watch and is currently at Tesla, and we're really looking forward to asking him lots of interesting questions and hearing what he has to say about his work at the moment. Hi, David, how are you?
Doing well, George. Thanks for having me today.
Good, thank you for joining us. Before we get going and announce our agenda, we'd just like to say a quick thank you to Crypterium. They're the sponsors for our stream today. Crypterium is currently building a mobile app that will turn cryptocurrencies into money that you can spend with the same ease as cash. You can shop around the world and pay with your coins and tokens at near-field communication terminals or scanning the QR codes. So thank you to Crypterium. Yeah, David, could you just give our viewers a bit of an insight into what you do?
What do I do? Well, I've been fortunate to have a somewhat varied career here in Silicon Valley. So I've worked on a variety of stuff, but I do, I guess what you'd call embedded development most of the time. I kind of had some roots in Game Boy Advance development, which helped me get rolling on that. And then I worked on the iPod Nano for several years, which was at the time was, I think, Apple's biggest selling product. And then they kind of transitioned us to working on the Apple Watch, the very first version of the Apple Watch. And then after a brief stint at a consumer electronics startup, I'm now working on autopilot at Tesla. So it's pretty different. It's very AI based machine learning type of environment, but still an embedded system. So that's kind of the common thread.
Great, awesome. As I'm sure you're right, sort of so many people are getting sort of more and more interested in technology in general as it becomes part of our everyday lives, increasingly so. We're really interested to, if you wouldn't mind telling us how you kind of how you started to get into and apply for positions at sort of companies like Apple. How did you arrive applying for that job?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a lot of it is honestly a little bit accidental, right? Like you can't always plan for that ahead of time.
Yeah.
But I had been working at the time. I was working at a web startup, so I was doing like web development.
Okay.
But I knew I had that background in embedded from my Game Boy days, basically. And the folks at Apple really, I mean, I didn't really expect that to translate necessarily, but the folks at Apple really appreciated that. And then when they saw my resume, I think they thought that I would be a good candidate for the iPod Nano, which was kind of a similar hardware platform. And so I applied to Apple just because I really admired the company, right? I love their products, and I think really sharp people, and they clearly have their priorities straight and the right values, I think. And so I applied there, ended up working on the iPod for several years, and it was just an amazing experience. Just really great group of people. And I felt like I saw eye to eye with their philosophy there of really being design driven and UX driven. And so it was a great fit. I'm really glad that I ended up going there.
Sure. What age did you start to learn to code? So I appreciate sort of interest through Game Boys and everything, but was there an age where you really started to get into coding and learning
Yeah, I think I started maybe a little bit late by today's standards. I feel like now kids are starting when they're in elementary school. But yeah, like really when I was in high school, I was probably like 16, 17 years old is when I first started coding. And yeah, I mean, it started kind of like on my TI calculator, and then I just started writing, C++ on my PC and stuff like that.
Okay.
But yeah, I wasn't like I wasn't one of those like from the womb, like super early. But I just really took to it, and like honestly, it kind of. I think I had been considering like pursuing a career in medicine up until halfway through high school, and it wasn't until then that I found software and really fell in love with it and just stuck with it since then.
Okay. So would you say it's fair to say that your career's slightly been sort of serendipitous in terms of sort of just being interested, coding in your spare time, and then one thing leads to another, and would that be fair to say?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I try to be strategic about it, and I think we all do. But I actually was. I think Steve Jobs once said that you can't really connect the dots going forward. Like you can't really see the future, but if you look back, at the path you've taken, then it all makes sense. And I think that's been true for me as well. Like, I mean, I still, obviously, I'm in my 30s, so I still have a long way to go. But I don't really know where it's going to go from here, but I feel like I've always at the time taken the right step, go to the place that I think is promising or the place where there's interesting things happening, smart people.
Mhm.
And that's always kind of worked out because you end up meeting the right people, you end up being turned on to the right technologies, and you can kind of see the trends and follow them to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, as we go through our questions, we're particularly interested actually because of sort of the amount of people we get asking how to get started, or how can I approach these big tech companies for jobs and interviews. Could you give us some insight into if we start with Apple, what was your interview for Apple like? So you said they liked sort of your angle with sort of your Game Boy and that. But what was your interview actually like for your job for the iPod?
Yeah, I mean, getting started, as you mentioned, is definitely the hardest part.
Sure.
I think once I had Apple on my resume, for example, then all sorts of doors were open. But it's that first entree that I think is really difficult. But the interview at Apple, I think, was pretty typical of most tech companies, which is basically they did like a phone screen where they had, I think it was my manager who would eventually become my manager.
Okay.
We just did like a half-hour phone call where he asked me some relatively simple questions, basically just to make sure that I knew what I was talking about. And then I wasn't a complete faker. And then after that, it was a full day. I came on site to Apple to their office, and I spent a full day there interviewing with probably 10 or 12 different people. Apple does groups of two. Some companies do one-on-one.
Mhm.
And so yeah, and it's just mainly technical questions and writing code on the whiteboard, and you get your pen, and you have to answer their questions, come up with algorithms, and talk through it, and they will like to see the way you think and make sure you can problem solve from different angles and be open minded. So they're evaluating a bunch of different stuff, and luckily when I was at Apple when we started the Watch program, it was a very extremely small group of us,
Mhm.
but we knew we had to grow it into this large organization to support the watch development. And so we ended up spending probably over half my time interviewing for a while.
Wow.
And yeah, so I at that point I got a ton of experience kind of on the other side of the table of being an interviewer, which has helped me in future interviews as well. But yeah, they're evaluating mainly like problem solving ability and then some domain knowledge, things like that. So there's going to be a lot of technical questions, and it's by the end of the day you're exhausted, right? Like going through that gauntlet. Um, but it's fun at the same time. It's challenging.
Sure. It's interesting you said you got to see the other side of the table, if you can call it. What would you say really sort of stood out for you from being on the other side, being the interviewer rather than the interviewee?
Um, that's a good question. I think the one thing you want to see on that side of the table is that you want to see the thought process, right? And so the most important thing for the interviewee is to really talk through what they're thinking, right? It's really hard if somebody gets up there and is basically just silent or is not communicative, and you ask them a question and they don't really give you any back and forth like feedback to go off of. So I think that's the most important thing from the interviewer side is like, okay, like I wanted this to be kind of a collaborative. I'm going to work with you to get to a solution to this problem.
Mm.
And I think if the interviewee fosters that, then they have a really good chance of like
Yeah.
being successful, even if they don't necessarily get the quote unquote like right answer to the question.
Okay. That definitely makes sense. And then you after your time at Apple, you then started you became involved or started your startup. How can you kind of elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so I love startups in general, and big companies have their pros and cons as well. But I was at that time in my career, I was definitely ready for a startup. I just kind of felt that, and I was talking to a guy that I worked with at Apple, who's one of the smartest guys I knew there, and just kind of brainstorming like different startups we might start or join.
Mm.
And he mentioned that he had been talking to this group of other people, other Applers about starting a company. And basically when he told me who was involved right away, I was like, count me in. And so it was just one of those circumstances where the people involved are really sharp, and also not only really sharp, but just really good people that you want to work with,
Yeah.
which is also something that we always evaluate interviewing as well. Like we look for things like humility, qualities like that, where somebody that you can be in the trenches with. And so, yeah, I basically joined that company just because of the people involved. And it ended up being an amazing experience. Unfortunately, the startup shut down a few years later, so it didn't work out incredibly well financially.
Mm.
But still, like it was, just to be able to work with that team was awesome.
Yeah, I bet. And I've worked almost exclusively for remote startups, so I can definitely empathise with the small teams that you often work with. What would you say? I mean, it might sound obvious, but what would you say is the difference between the working environment of, say, a large company, a very large company like Apple, and maybe a more flexible, small startup? What are the differences that you experience working for both?
Oh, it's like night and day. It's like a completely different job, right? And at a large company, there's just a lot more communication overhead. There's a lot more, like the work is divided up into small teams generally, and so if you want to get something done, you typically have to coordinate like a cross-functional effort, and you have to have a lot of meetings and get schedules to line up and get buy-in from a lot of people, and there's just a lot more there's a lot more kind of meta work going on, right? Like non-engineering work. At a startup, you typically wear a lot of hats, and so you're kind of doing everything yourself,
Mm.
which simplifies all of that. Like decision making is easier. Like you just make all the decisions, and you can basically just run as fast as you can on the engineering side, which is exhilarating, and it's a very freeing feeling. Which is why I think I enjoy it. At the same time, the startups are resource constrained, so it'd be really hard to do what we do at Tesla, for example, at a startup because we wouldn't be able to afford this big fleet of cars and all of the equipment and resources that we draw upon to develop autopilot.
Sure, sure. Um, I've I've certainly read and spoken to people about how you can often have a half startup micro ecosystem within a larger company.
Hmm.
It tends to be sort of relatively common. Um, is that sort of the case with your work at Tesla at the moment? Is the automation and autopilot team perhaps sort of like a hybrid startup, or is it much more sort of just Tesla writ large?
It is no, it is sort of the case. Autopilot, we have our own basically computer on the car, right, which we, you know, pretty much control, and so it does make us a fairly autonomous unit, I guess, pun intended, to within Tesla, which is great. But and I think at Apple, when I started at Apple, that was more common there as well. Like each group was operated pretty siloed and independently from each other. I remember during my Apple interview, um, this was right around the time when the iPhone came out, and so I asked the iPod team, how much code do you share with the iPhone, for example, like even basic stuff like text rendering and things like that. Is that like all like shared libraries? And they said no, like nothing. Basically, there's basically nothing shared between the two, which shocked me at the time because I thought like you're not kind of leveraging this work. But at the same time, I really actually appreciated that working for iPod because because it meant that, like, if we wanted to make a change, for example, in one of those areas, we didn't have to coordinate with other teams that were using the same libraries and whatnot. And so it really freed up the iPod team to set their own direction and to operate, like you're saying, like a startup within Apple, and not really have to be bogged down by a lot of coordinating, I guess.
Yeah, sure, sure. Um, I don't know. I don't know if Victor earlier sent. We've recently done an article just taking a snapshot of median salaries,
Mhm.
a general global, but based mostly on US and UK in tech. Um, what has been? It doesn't have to be personal, but it seems that sort of the bulk of funding and development generally in business is in tech now.
Mm.
Not completely, obviously, but it seems to be still the innovative sector. Do you see kind of essentially more jobs opening up? More positions. Obviously, that you've got the engineers, but then you need the managers, etc. Do you see the industry continuing to expand into the next sort of decade? What are your thoughts on that?
I think so. I'm optimistic. I mean, I think it's there's aside from a couple of brief kind of downturns, the industry has been growing like crazy for decades now, and I think it's an area that will continue to do so. I mean, I think uh, I think Mark Andreessen said software is eating the world, right? And it
Right.
still has a long way to go.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a ton of industry. There's still a ton of opportunity out there that is yet to be disrupted by software.
Mhm.
As much as it's become pervasive in our lives, there's still just tons of open fields left out there. Um, so yeah, I think it's an industry that's going to continue to grow for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our sort of the final section of our questions, we're going to switch over to our new economy club, which we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
So we'll pass that over to our producers who are going to switch the stream. So if you can just bear with us for just sort of 60 seconds, we'll do that.
Alrighty.
So thank you very much for now, and we'll come back in a minute. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, George.
Cheers. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our stream. Thank you for joining us in our New Economy Club. And thank you, David, for joining us again. Um, so let's get straight back to it. As you've worked with Apple and Tesla, we're interested to know if you've worked with both Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. Have you had the opportunity to work with both of them?
Yeah, and honestly, that's been somewhat intentional on my part. Those are both men that I admire,
Sure.
and so I've had I've had the somewhat unique opportunity of working with both of them. I worked at Apple when Steve was still there. Unfortunately, he passed away during my time there, and then I work with Elon now,
Okay.
and they're both just visionary men, and I think it's really great to have like a product visionary at the head of the company. I
Mhm.
think that really helps the whole company set a good, ambitious, and innovative course. And so they're similar in a lot of ways, and different in some. But I've really appreciated learning from them. I've worked more closely with Elon.
Okay.
I get to like actually interact with him, go to meetings and stuff like that, which has been a learning experience for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. Would you say I'm sure there are plenty of positive things you picked up from working with both of them. But are there any sort of standout characteristics or way they work which sort of separates them from, say, other founders? What would be your opinion on that?
Well, I think to me, the thing that set Steve apart the most was just his incredibly high bar.
Hmm.
Like he just wouldn't, if we would do what, I think everybody on the team was really good at Apple and did really good work and really amazing work. But he just refused to ship anything that wasn't, near perfect. And so there were, many instances where we would have a prototype or, an app or a device or a product that we thought was really cool, and we would demo it to him, and he would make the difficult decision of saying like, this is great, but we're not going to do this. Not It's not good enough, basically. And I think to have somebody really discerning like that at the top is necessary. Otherwise, what I see from a lot of other companies is stuff gets shipped out and goes to customers, and it's maybe not up to the highest standards, right? And I think Steve really took that upon himself to make sure that anything that Apple put out there was up to his standard, and he was kind of the last word on that, and I really appreciate it.
And how about Elon? Um,
Elon, so what's funny is they both like to be involved in the details, but in very different ways. Like Steve had to improve every wallpaper that we put on the iPod Nano. Like the designers would show him dozens of options, and he would choose six, the best ones. And so he was very much involved in the details in that sense. And Elon is as well. I think what differentiates Steve from Elon is Elon really likes to be involved in the engineering details, and he really wants to understand how things work, and he wants to also influence that, right? He likes coming up with his own ideas and presenting those to the team and things like that, which is really cool. He's a great. Sometimes, when you're an engineer or a team of engineers, you get really focused on the details and you're deep in the trenches. And Elon can bring a different perspective, more of a high level perspective, and look at the problem from a different angle, while still being an engineer himself. So it's really helpful.
Great, yeah. Um, as we mentioned earlier, sort of, many of our viewers are interested in either starting out in careers in tech or continuing their career development. You mentioned obviously that you are currently working with machine learning and AI. Um, is that just a part of the industry which is really expanding rapidly? What has been your experience with the resources now being committed to machine learning?
Yeah, there's been a huge swing, I would say, over the past 5 to 10 years. Well, I think a lot of it is just from technological advancements, right? Like AI has gotten a lot more, a lot stronger, way more powerful. And so there's just a lot more potential there. And I think companies have recognized that, and everybody is dedicating huge resources to it. There's a lot of education going on in that area, but there's also a lot of product development. And it's influencing pretty much every industry you can imagine, and I think that's only just beginning, honestly. I
Okay.
still think we're at the early stages of that. So I would say, if I was to project into the future, that there's a really bright future for AI and deep learning and things like that.
So would you say it's well worth, if anyone's interested uh, in that area of engineering development, that they should really look into it, read up on it, see if they can find some, I don't know, online courses or a local course, and so it's definitely worth looking into if you're interested in it.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I think it's definitely worthwhile. It's an exciting area. It's a fun area, and I think it's the type of thing where it's a new capability that we have that has been applied in some areas. But I think if you can be creative and apply it in new spaces, that you could go a long way.
Sure, great. That's really good to hear. Um, so that's certainly one career direction that people can choose. I think there's some opinion that saturated is obviously the wrong word, but because coding has certainly got more accessible, which is great, that some people might feel that they're late to the game. That everyone, but everyone's trying to be a web developer. Um, do you think we're reaching a saturation point, or just because technology is evolving at such a great rate that actually there's going to be space for everyone interested in wanting to work in the kind of area?
I definitely think it's going to continue to expand. So I would not say we're reaching a saturation point. The line I would draw is, um, like if you love technology, if you love software, and you love working on it,
Yeah,
then I think you will have no problem finding a good career in technology. I think some people go into it because it's a booming industry, or it's lucrative, or kind of for the wrong reasons. And I feel like maybe those people might have a harder time building a career out of it. But for those of us who like live and breathe it, and think and code basically,
yeah.
I do think that there's going to be a home for those people for a long time to come.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely interesting to hear, and certainly good advice as well. Um, uh, uh, is Tesla, if we can flip back to Tesla, or flip Tesla, um, are there because of the model line expansion with the cars that Tesla are offering, um, are there sort of is Tesla actively recruiting? Is there a good recruitment turnover at the moment in your experience?
Yeah, we are always hiring, always looking for people, always interviewing. Pretty much at least every week, I interview somebody on
Oh,
my
wow.
team at Tesla. And so, yeah, I mean, and Tesla is a company that is they're very focused on their financials right now. I guess
Right.
is one way of putting
Yeah.
it. If you've read the news, the last couple of quarters we've been profitable, which is great. But
Mhm.
in order to achieve that, we've really had to focus on that. Right? Like we've had to divert some of our focus from purely our product and engineering development to really make sure that financially everything is in order within the company,
Sure.
basically. And so that being said, even when we're trying to really control spending, control costs, like we don't stop hiring. And when it comes to groups that really need help and really need more resources. So yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing process, constantly looking for new talent and new people.
Awesome. Without asking you to breach any NDAs, can you give us any insight into the rough timescale of autopilot with Tesla? Um,
Like the future roadmap,
yeah, yeah.
probably not, unfortunately. But I mean, I think everybody understands that the goal is full self-driving, right? And we're gonna get there as quickly as we can, and we're pushing really hard on that.
Amazing.
And I think the recent release that includes Navigate on Autopilot, where basically the car is more or less full self-driving from highway on ramp to highway off ramp, and it takes freeway interchanges and it changes lanes for you and things like that, and it takes your freeway exit. That's a huge step in that direction, and we're super proud to have shipped that to customers.
Incredible. That's so exciting to hear. Um, no doubt at the moment, obviously, you're completely satisfied with your work at Tesla, and as you say, you often join the dots when you look back at your career. If there were not necessarily a company, but an area you could see yourself at next, would it be to continue with AI and machine learning, and developing that route, or can you see at some point in the future another career pivot? What can you give us any insights into that at all?
Yeah, I think the autonomous space in general is really cool right now, and it's really exciting. I'm really happy to be working in, I think, the best positioned team in that space.
Sure.
But I think there's also other exciting opportunities there. Like I am also a private pilot, so it's
Wow.
kind of a hobby of mine. And so something in like the autonomous drone space, or the autonomous, even like human transport, would be super interesting to me. I think it would be a good intersection of my interests.
Yeah, definitely. That's really great to hear. And final question, actually, because we're getting close to the end of our stream. We'd really appreciate, you've given us fantastic advice throughout, actually, for everyone listening. But if you would have any kind of final words of advice for people interested in building a career in technology and the tech industry, would you have any thoughts to give our viewers?
Yeah, I think my final thought would be to be uh, like a self starter, and not just work within the constraints and the bounds that you're given at work, but to take your own initiative and go out and learn things on your own. I think that's the most important thing, is to um, just seek out new knowledge and new technologies and new capabilities on your own time, and study and practice, and start posting a bunch of stuff in your GitHub repo, just to show that, like, you're exploring on your own, you're learning on your own, you're not just kind of taking what is fed to you. And I think that's the most important thing, to keep expanding your knowledge and expanding your interest as well.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Well, thank you very much for giving us your time today. It's been really fascinating to speak to you and to hear your a wealth of experience. So thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you very much, George. It's been a pleasure.
Not at all. And we hope to have you on again at some point in the future. And can't wait to see the final ship product of the autopilot on Tesla. That'll be really exciting to watch. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.